Tonight, we're honored to have a keynote speaker who comes to us from Brigham Young University, who also comes to us from the American Enterprise Institute's project, which is called the Open Source Policy Center. And he's going to talk to us more about that and what they're doing there. But Dr. Rick Evans has had experience in the private sector. He's had experience working in and working with folks in the halls back in Washington, D.C. He has been somebody who has brought forth ideas today that are very relevant at a time where we have dynamic scoring now a requirement for legislation coming out at the federal level. And how are we going to get there? How are we going to agree? I mean, there's a lot of contention about static scoring of bills and what their impact is without looking at behavior changing as a result of legislation and all the interrelationships of human behavior and the economy. We're moving into an era where there's a requirement to do it in many states and in Washington, D.C., and it's also an opportunity to craft policy that we know will increase prosperity and solve a lot of these pressing issues that we have. So it's an exciting time, and Dr. Evans is right in the middle of the cutting edge of that movement forward. Dr. Evans gets to play with a very big computer at BYU, and which he's involved with supercomputers and runs their macroeconomics center at BYU. So I appreciated him coming out here tonight. I think we'll learn a lot. I think you'll enjoy very much his presentation. So without further ado, I want to welcome Dr. Rick Evans.
This is going to take a second. I've got, I think, 7 microphones that they've got me hooked up with. Not quite 7, almost 7. Then putting it on your belt's like putting a corsage on your date. Good grief. That look about right? Whew. So first of all, I have a pretty tall order. Now, before I do anything, I got to thank Lou and Susan and Eric and Chris and Dee Dee McConnell for bringing me out. They've been tremendous hosts, and we should probably just give them another hand for that. Another impressive thing that they've done is they've asked somebody on this planet to give a presentation on tax policy and tax modeling and make it entertaining and fun. Which that's really, really hard to do. But Lou brought up a little bit of what I'm going to talk about. He talked about dynamic scoring and static scoring. So I'm going to use a football analogy for kind of my main metaphor for what I think are some of the issues and what I think are some of the solutions to modeling tax policy. Here's what I'm going to cover. I'm going to make a Pete Carroll analogy to start off, and this is going to be a little painful. I've talked to many of you in the room, and many of you are lifelong Seattle, Washington residents, and so just kind of fasten your seatbelt, and we'll just go through that again. And then I'm going to talk about the difficulties of tax modeling and why Pete Carroll's a great example for this. And then I'll talk about what I think is a solution for some of these problems, which is opening up the models, doing open source tax modeling. I'll show you some of the things that we're doing with that. One of these things is something I saw for the first time this morning. And I'll show that to you. And then we'll talk about some Washington State issues. So I should be done talking at about 10 after 8, and then we'll have 20 minutes of question and answer. And this isn't that formal of a presentation, and I'm not that formal of a guy, so please feel free, if you have a question or comment as I'm talking, throw it in. I may just ignore you, but I may not. I may answer it as well. So Lou mentioned that I hail from Provo, Utah. I'm involved with the Open Source Policy Center in Washington, D.C., but BYU is my home. I do macroeconomics, and I just wanted to give a quick little primer on what it means to do macroeconomics. So you laugh, but this is what I do. This is my world. If you look in the blogosphere, there's a lot of complaints about macroeconomics. We just had this major macroeconomic event, the Great Recession. It was the biggest macroeconomic event since the Great Depression. And there's been a lot of complaints about macroeconomics. Why is it so mathy? Why didn't you predict the Great Recession? There's a joke about Economist that we've predicted 9 out of the last 5 recessions. So you could also say, why did so many of you predict the Great Recession? That's probably not true, though. But the question about why is it so mathy, truthfully, math and computation is the laboratory for macroeconomics. The reason, in other sciences, how do you do experiments? You take some particles, send them around the super collider, and you crash them into each other, and you blow them up, and you measure what happened to those particles. You can't do that with people. Correction, you can do that with people, it's just not ethical to run them into each other, blow them up, and treat them in that manner. There are some experiments you can do on people. They're called natural experiments, where what you do is you take a state like Washington where there's no income tax, you take a state like Utah where there is an income tax, and you look at the differences. The problem with that experiment is it's hard to hold everything else constant. It's hard to say that, well, personal income went up in Utah or personal income went up in Washington because they have no income tax. There are other things happening in those states. So natural experiments are difficult to do well. And so what do we do in macroeconomics? We build mathematical models of how people behave, of how firms behave, and how people and firms interact. And then you can do anything you want to those models. You can blow them up. You can light them on fire, and you don't go to jail for doing that. So you simulate these models. So you write down the math, then you turn that math into computer code, because often the math is hard enough that you can't just solve it algebraically. And then you get really nice pictures that tell you what the answer is. So that's kind of the background of macroeconomics, of what we do and the way we approach it. And that's actually why evaluating tax policy is so difficult. Okay, so the title of this slide is Sunday School in Palo Alto. This is a story to introduce my Pete Carroll example. I want to tell you about something that happened to me last summer. I'm a macroeconomist. I was running a computational workshop at Stanford and the Hoover Institution last summer. It was about 2 weeks. I took a couple of my undergraduate students down there, and like I said, I'm at Brigham Young University, so I'm a Mormon economist. I tell you that even though you never want to talk about religion and politics in a big group. I tell you that because this experience doesn't happen to you unless you're a Mormon economist. So we're down at Stanford, and on Sunday I take my students and we go to church at this little Mormon congregation in Palo Alto. And we sit down, and there's a Sunday school lesson going on, and it's about some chapter in the Old Testament, 2 Kings, and the teacher walks in, and it's Hall of Fame quarterback Steve Young comes up to the front of the room and starts talking about the Old Testament. And it was actually a lesson on tax policy. I'm at this conference, and we're presenting these big fancy models, these things about tax policy, and then there's this Old Testament lesson about 2 kings, one's king of Judah, one's the king of Israel. One of them was like good king, bad king. One of them didn't do heavy taxes on the people, and the other one kind of ignored all the wise old men and put heavy taxes on the people. And then Steve Young goes into this talk about, well, I do Monday Night Football, and I see all these NFL coaches, and some of them rule by fear and an iron fist, and some of them, like Bill Walsh, who I played for at the 49ers. I know that's the team who must not be named, right? Is that? Boo. But Steve Young liked Bill Walsh. Pete Carroll was with the 49ers. I think he was the defensive coordinator. So he said, and Pete Carroll also, these guys ruled not ruled, they kind of govern their teams in a family atmosphere of trust and responsibility. And so he compared these two kings. His point was to compare leadership style, but I was in there thinking, oh man, I'm getting tax policy in church from Hall of Fame quarterback. That is the best. But he was talking about the mind of Pete Carroll. And as we know, for the last 4 months, that mind has been scrutinized tremendously. Just, what was he thinking? And I think more critical is, how do you evaluate whether he made a good decision? Because on any given play in the NFL, if the other team knows what you're going to do, or if they guess right what you're going to do, you're going to fail. So how do you evaluate Pete Carroll? This is my analogy to tax policy. I want to just take us back through that painful experience where the Seahawks get the ball. Yeah, I know, we got to go there. We have to go there. I mean, from my perspective, this looks like one of those YouTube videos of Super Bowl parties where Seahawks fans filmed themselves, and then in the last 2 minutes, you just see their souls drop out. So here's why I want to take you back there. 28-24, the Patriots have just scored. Seahawks get the ball on the 20-yard line, what was it? They get a pass to Marshawn Lynch down the right-hand side about 30 yards, left-hand side, and run a couple more plays. And then you've got that pass to Curse down the right-hand side. And it goes over this cornerback on the Patriots who is a rookie free agent scrub who they've been owning. The Seahawks have been owning him all day. Granted, that was an amazing catch, the juggle with all 4 limbs and then catching the ball. Comes down on the 5-yard line, and then Seattle runs a running play, and now there's 26 seconds left in the game. Whew, I know. I did not want the Patriots to win. I was pulling for the Seahawks, but not like you were. And then we all know what happens. They pass. And this same corner, Malcolm Butler, who they've been owning all day, it's a pass to Lockett. Butler jumps the route, miraculously makes an interception, and the game is over. Pete Carroll's the worst coach ever. Who would do that? I'm being facetious here. I don't really think he's the worst coach ever, but a lot of people in the locker room did. These are tweets from media in the Seahawks locker room right after that play. So standing with the Seahawks as they walk through the tunnel, and one says, best back in football, and we throw the ball on the 1-yard line. Another, Mike Freeman, Seahawks players are ripping the hell out of that last call openly. So this is the players questioning their coach. Of course they are. I'm in the Seahawks locker room. Wow, talking about despair. Those who can speak freely are ripping that last play call. Big time. And last one, John Boyle. Defensive end Bruce Irvin said, we had it. I don't understand how you don't give it to the best back in the league on the 1-yard line. I mean, we're all amazing after the fact at saying what the Seahawks should have done. But the question is, do you get rid of Pete Carroll after this? Was this just the stupidest decision ever? How do you evaluate it? So here's some questions that I came up with of how you would try to evaluate Pete Carroll. Why would you pass? This is what every tweet was about. First of all, why would you pass the ball and not run the ball? Secondly, is there any explanation, is there any set of circumstances under which you pass the ball in that scenario? Is there any set of circumstances that makes that the right call? After the fact, this third one is for after the play, how does the front office evaluate whether Pete Carroll did the right thing, whether you should keep him around? And lastly, this is the one that we do a lot in economics, and you hear the announcers in the football say, in the NFL games say, is if you run that play 10 times, how many times does X happen? If you're on the 1-yard line in that situation, and you're able to repeat the universe 10 times, how many times does Malcolm Butler jump that route and intercept the football? So the only way to answer those questions, or if you can actually look into Pete Carroll's mind and know why he did that. So this is a long quote, but I'm just going to read it. This is what he said in the press conference after the game. I'll tell you again if you want to hear again. Here's the deal. We sent our guys out on the field, wide receivers on the field, spread them out. They, meaning the Patriots, ran their goal line set. They sent all their big guys out there. At that moment, I didn't want to waste a run play against their goal line guys. Throw the ball, we come in on 3rd and 4th down, and we can match up. It's a really clear thought. It wasn't something that happened. It was a clear thought, but it didn't work out right. We happened to throw them the ball, and they just made a big play. That's a play that's supposed to work versus 2 guys covering one-on-one, and the guy jumped underneath and made the play. At this time, it seems like overthinking, but they have goal line guys on. The Patriots have their big guys on. We have 3 wide receivers, a tight end, and 1 back. In that situation, they've got extra guys at the line of scrimmage, so we don't want to waste a run play at that. It's not a there's a set of scenarios in which that's a great play. If Lockett catches the ball, Pete Carroll's a genius. So what do you want in your coach? You want the guy who's going to give you the best chance of winning every week and the best chance of going to the Super Bowl. How do you know if that's Pete Carroll? In terms of tax policy, it's kind of a similar question. How do you know what tax is best? Probably over the next few years, the state of Washington, as well as the national economy, is going to have to raise some tax revenue. Nationally, we've got issues with Social Security. In the state of Washington, you've got issues with infrastructure, with education. You're going to have to raise some money. That's going to come from somewhere, unless it's on the apple trees. And how are you going to get it? Are there different sets of circumstances under which increasing the B&O tax is better than adding a little income tax or increasing the sales tax? Those are hard questions. How are you going to answer those questions? After the fact, after a tax is put in place, or maybe after Washington State decides not to have an income tax, how do you evaluate whether that was a good decision? That's actually really hard to do. And lastly, something that we do a lot with the type of work that I do, if you simulate this economy 10 times, and let's say you cut the income tax, how many of those 10 times do you get an increase in revenue? How many of those 10 times do you get a decrease in revenue? The answers to those questions are kind of dependent on what your model looks like. Maybe the term model, maybe the right term there is what's your philosophy? The person whose mind that you have to look in to answer those questions is the macro economy. And that's a really complex mind. Pete Carroll's pretty complex. Actually, maybe Pete Carroll's pretty simple. You just need meat and football, and you're Pete Carroll. The macroeconomy, think about how complex the macroeconomy is. To answer all of those questions about the effects of tax policy, you've got to understand 400 million people interacting, millions of firms. Some of the people are old, some of the people are young, some of the people are white, some are black, some are poor, some are rich, some live in the state of Virginia, some live in the state of Washington. These are all very different facts that are really hard to model. So our macroeconomic models, we don't have any macroeconomic models that really capture all the mechanisms and channels that are at play in trying to figure out what tax policy does. There are none. Everything we have are pretty gross summaries of what happens in the macroeconomy. So for tax, there are a lot of different macro models, first of all. I'm not going to get into all of them, but for tax policy, there are 3 main places where you get these models. We'll see this a lot in the 2016 presidential election. Every candidate, Democrat and Republican, is going to have a tax policy, and they'll have a revenue estimate. They're going to say, I'm going to cut the income tax of the top bracket and increase the inheritance tax and decrease this exemption, and there will be about 6 things. And they'll say, and this will be revenue neutral. That is, that tax revenues won't change. Where does that number come from? It comes from one of these 3 places. For Congress, the official place that gives you revenue estimates is the Joint Committee on Taxation. I'm going to talk about them in a second. They really have an impossible job. Then you've got the Tax Policy Center that's associated with the Urban Institute. They're slightly left of center on the political spectrum. And then you've got the Tax Foundation that's slightly right on the political spectrum. But all of them have their own proprietary models for estimating the effect of a tax change. And these models aren't even the same. They're all a little bit different from each other. That is, if Hillary Clinton gives her tax plan to each of these 3 centers and says, you guys each have the same inputs. Here's what I'm going to do with tax policy. They run it. Each of those 3 will come up with a different estimate. It'll be close, but it won't be the same. So these are not the same. Let me describe a little bit what the Joint Committee on Taxation does, and then we'll get into the juicy stuff. So here's their impossible job. They're the official revenue estimator for Congress. So if a legislator has a tax plan, they bring it to the JCT, and the JCT gives them a revenue estimate. They get between 6,000 and 7,000 requests a year. That's 16 per day. And for each of these, they've got to run a big model. If you're able to set it up right, it might only take a half hour to run it, or an hour to run it. I was meeting with the Joint Committee on Taxation. They didn't tell me exactly how long it takes, but it's more than 15 minutes. 16 a day, though, and the setup of running these takes a while. You got to be smart about, how do I put this exact policy of yours into my big model that I have. So they've got to do that. These estimates are kept private until the legislator releases that information. Once the legislator does, then the Joint Committee on Taxation publishes a document that says exactly what they did. So most of those 6,000 and 7,000 requests are private. I would actually guess that most of those 6,000 and 7,000 requests don't get filled during the year. There's actually really big waiting times. Also, what they give you in the end is a point estimate. This is like trying to predict the score of the Super Bowl next year with the teams set up from 2 years ago. And so you got to get this revenue estimate that's just 1 point of saying Team X is going to win next year. You got to start 2 years ago, not even with the Seahawks and the Patriots Super Bowl. You got to start before then, figure out where all the players on the teams go in the next year, who wins this last year's Super Bowl, and then you forecast from that what next year's Super Bowl is. This is a hard business, and all they give you in the end is a point estimate. What that means, what's missing, is you don't know, there's probably some likelihood that the 49ers beat well, let's use a different team. That the Dallas Cowboys make it to the Super Bowl. There's a chance every year. They never make it, but they've got a chance. Poor Jerry Jones. But what you don't get with these JCT estimates is you don't get a sense of what are the probabilities of the other things that could happen. You're just getting a point estimate. And these models, this is something that I've learned, these models have hundreds of economic assumptions inside of them. And the fact is with these many, many, many assumptions, often they're just parameters in the model that represent people's behavior. Things like elasticities. If I increase the wage, which is happening in the Seattle area, this $15 minimum wage, are people going to work a lot more? That's just one parameter in these models that say, if I increase the wage by $1, people work an extra hour, something like that. You got a bunch of those, hundreds of these elasticities. They're also holding some things constant that aren't going to be constant, like aggregate variables, GDP. You increase the minimum wage in Seattle, that might change total output in the Seattle area. In these models, those things are assumed to be constant. And then distributions, that's kind of deep in the trees. A lot of assumptions. The point is that if I'm an evil consultant, and I'm not saying that the Joint Committee on Taxation is, I actually think they do an excellent job with this stuff, but an evil consultant could take a model like this and make it say anything they want. So Eric was saying this at the beginning, that sometimes economists get paid to do that. That's true. These models with hundreds of parameters, you can make them say anything you want. So the question is, how do you know if this point estimate, when Hillary Clinton or Jeb Bush come out with an estimate on their tax plan of what it's going to do to revenues, how do you know if what was under the hood, what was in the mind of Pete Carroll, what was in the model that created this tax plan, this revenue estimate, how do you know if that was right? So these are the exact problems with these kind of proprietary models. If something like that comes out, I can't question it. I can't go to the Joint Committee on Taxation and say, okay, how did you arrive at a $71 billion deficit over the next 5 years from this tax plan? We already talked about this, that if I'm not the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, if I'm just a lowly congressman on that committee, the least senior one, I may have to wait a year to get a revenue estimate on my tax plan that I think is so amazing and is going to save the country. I'm not at the front of the line. And I want to give you an example that happened to Mitt Romney in the 2012 presidential campaign, but this could apply to any candidate, Republican or Democrat. So July 2012, he comes out with his tax plan. He had been pushed for a long time to say, what are you going to propose for your tax plan? He comes out with it. It involved cutting the income tax rates across the board by something like 20%. It involved broadening the base, limiting deductions. And he said that it was going to be revenue neutral, that it wasn't going to reduce tax revenues. And then at the beginning of August, the Tax Policy Center came out with a review of his plan and said, no, it's actually going to cost about $86 billion a year in revenues for the next 5 years. That's a big difference. That killed Mitt Romney, and at least killed his tax plan. He's getting beat up in the press. A few people started questioning the Tax Policy Center. They don't have the Tax Policy Center's model, so the way they had to go about it was they said, well, what are the assumptions in your model about this thing? And what are the assumptions in your model about this thing? And they just had to probe, and they actually found a couple of things that would make this estimate less bad. And so the Tax Policy Center on August 16th, 2 weeks later, comes out with an addendum that says, yeah, it might not be as bad as negative $86 billion a year. It might only be $41 billion a year deficit. And if these other things happen that these guys have talked about, then it might even, in the best possible scenario, be revenue neutral. But by then, the media cycle had kind of moved on, and he never recovered on his tax policy. And so these problems with, let me just go back to here, these problems with proprietary models, I think, are really big. The fact that I was talking with my table, the Retail Association, about how do you guys come up with what tax policies you advocate or fight against? And it has to do with how each firm feels about a tax policy and what the consultants say about that tax policy. And my question here is, how do you even know what the consultants are saying is right? How do you even know if what the Joint Committee on Taxation, the official arbiter of tax policy, how do you know if what they're saying is right? And so our solution that, let me tell you how I got into this. Our solution is open source tax policy models. And I was for the last 4 years, I've been building really large-scale models to do things with Social Security, to forecast what's going to happen to the Social Security Trust Fund, to look at tax policy, and a lot of things with big computation. And these guys, I met the guy who runs the Open Source Policy Center, and he said, why don't you guys help us build a dynamic scoring model and help us build a model just like what the Joint Committee on Taxation has, and we're going to make it open to everyone. Now that's when I talk to my friends in Washington, D.C. who are kind of policy wonks, they said, oh, everybody's tried that. It never works. The JCT and the TPC and the Tax Foundation, they're really the main places. The thing that has made this thing work is that we've got a lot of partners in this that have brought, like the people who helped build the JCT model have come to the table and helped build a model just like it. People at the National Bureau of Economic Research that run actually the best tax simulator in the country. It's called TaxSim. What a great name for a tax simulator. But that actually includes all the state tax policy. We've incorporated that into our micro simulation. And code is pretty fancy. Like, how many of us in this room are going to open up some Python computer code and start doing tax analysis? Not many. So we've partnered with a company in Austin, Texas to build a web app that I'm going to show you in a sec, where Joe Sixpack can come in and change the top income tax rate on the top bracket and see what that's going to do to revenues. One of the coolest things about this is the only way to solve this problem. It's fundamentally apolitical. People on the right can use this and see what it says about tax policy. People on the left can use this. And then if I make a tax estimate of how much revenues are going to change, Lou can come check that and see if it's correct. And say, Rick, but you're assuming this. You need to change this variable. And you see that you actually have an $8 trillion deficit from what you're trying to do. And the collaboration, this little point down here, it's amazing how disarming it is to go to someone who should be your competitor and say, I'm building an open source model that follows after what you do. So everyone, the Joint Committee on Taxation, the Congressional Budget Office, IRS, Treasury, those are kind of the same thing. And even academic groups with proprietary models have been willing to talk to us and share information, because in the worst case scenario, if we make any improvements, they can borrow our stuff. Open source, this is how Linux was developed. A group of people started writing code, and then that group got bigger, and they developed some ways to work collaboratively online and build what was a great operating system that has been used in many servers. Most of the servers in the world are Linux-based. Even private sector groups like H&R Block have been talking to us about the potential, we're not there yet, but about the potential of sharing their data to better inform our models. So here's a little screenshot of the website of the Open Source Policy Center. You can go to this website. It's actually, the web app for our micro simulator is still in beta, but I'm going to show you a little bit what it does. It's called TaxBrain. So what you do is you go into TaxBrain, and you can start, look at all the things on the right-hand side. You guys over here can't read that, but you can go through exemptions, standard deduction, Social Security and Medicare, all the way down to the personal income tax and the alternative minimum tax. Come into this website and just change the parameters, whatever your tax policy you want. Change the adjustments, the exemptions, the standard deduction, blah, blah, blah. Everyone's going to sleep on this. There we are, personal income tax. Now we're in business. This is where the real fun starts, is you can mess with the US income tax. You can make, if you wanted to ever see what a flat tax would do, you can do it here. We're not online right now, so I can't do it right now, but one could. And what you're going to get once you put all that stuff in and click this little button on the left, show me the results, you get the following. So this test is for increasing the standard exemption from $4,000 to $4,200. And it starts out, again, I don't know if you guys over there can see this, but it tells you 2015 through 2019, what's going to happen to revenues. So if you increase the standard deduction by $200, this is saying that in the first year, 2015, you're going to lose $7 billion of revenues. In the second year, you're going to lose 7.4, and it slowly goes up to 8.5 over time. What's more, and this is stuff that you don't get from any other of the proprietary models, but that this model is going to spit out, is you get the distributional effects. I'll just show you this table. This tells you how this policy is going to affect the poorest people, the bottom 10%, all the way up to the top 10%. How many of them are going to have their taxes increase? How many of them are going to have their taxes decrease? So we're doing this for the micro simulator that's supposed to be exactly like what the Joint Committee on Taxation does. This is in beta testing mode right now. It should be ready in July. The part that I am mainly working with is the dynamic scoring model. I don't think I have time to talk about that. But let's say you're more of a programmer. Let's say you're the economist for an organization, and you want to try some of your own tests that are a lot they're richer tests than what is available on the web app. You can go to this GitHub repository that has all the source code. And let's say you don't like the way our model is run. You can just download the source code and make your own additions. And if you're a good citizen of the universe, you might contribute those and say, hey, I think you did this poorly. Use this piece that goes better. Or if you're not, that's not fair to say good citizen of the universe. If you want it for yourself, for your own consulting firm, you can just take it. The ideal here is that hopefully groups on both the right and the left will use open source policy models to evaluate tax policy. Now, I think this is really important for the state of Washington. I've written down kind of what I see as some of the key issues in this state. The biggest point is going to be what I get to down here of what's missing in the models that answer these questions. But in Washington state, as with any state, state competitiveness is extremely important. You're not making policy in a vacuum. You don't want to make Washington look less attractive than Nevada, because people and businesses might move. Key policies that I talked about with Lou: B&O tax, potential of putting in an income tax, sales taxes, changes, gas taxes, inheritance tax, property tax. Some of the key issues in modeling, let's go back to the mind of Pete Carroll. How do you know if increases or decreases or changes in those things are going to be good for the state of Washington? A lot of the models that might tell you that are missing things like, if you increase the property tax or the income tax, high-income people will likely move out of the state. That doesn't seem, it seems like people are pretty sticky in the state of Washington, in that a lot of the people I've talked to have lived here for a long time in this room. But in spite of that, there's probably some tax rate at which you'd leave. The same thing applies to businesses. And this is not modeled in the economic models. If you increase the B&O tax on manufacturing or aerospace or technology, pick your industry, there's some level of taxation at which that firm's just going to leave. In a lot of the economic models, they're just assumed that everyone's going to stay here. And just recently in the big dynamic scoring models at the national level are those things being incorporated, but certainly not in anything I know of at the state level. So if you're going to take anything away from this talk, maybe just take away that Pete Carroll is a great football coach. But in addition to that, you got to know that in modeling tax policy, someone might tell you a number, but you've got to know what was under the hood, what produced that number. And that tax policy is kind of like a bad girlfriend or a bad boyfriend, where it is sensitive, is difficult, and can be two-faced, and that you can get two different answers from the same model depending on how you set it up. And not only in the state of Washington, but nationally and for many countries. Right now I'm working on this stuff at the national level, but states need this stuff as well. If you want to know what the right tax is, you got to model it properly. And my experience over the last 6 months has made me feel like there are a lot of people at the national level that are very interested in this. And my experience talking with you in this room is that at state levels, this is also really important. So with that, let me just finish and answer questions.